We're looking in this series at sort of the second part of Exodus, which is mostly concerned with the instructions that God gave the Israelites about how to live, the laws, how to build the tabernacle, all kinds of things. There are a lot of laws in the second part of Exodus, and alongside that, we're thinking about the idea of holiness. So the law was given to the people of Israel to set them apart, to make them distinct from the nations around them, to make them holy. So I spoke last week about holiness, the key to be idea of holiness being distinct, being different. But what I was suggesting was it's not just a matter of behavior. Actually, to be holy as God calls us to be holy, we need to think differently. We need to have a different worldview to the people around us. And today we're thinking about holy time. That's the topic, holy time. And we're looking at the passages where God commands the people of Israel to keep a Sabbath, as it's known. The call to be a people of God, I think, is not just a call to think differently about how we behave, but I think it's also a call to think differently about how the world works, about what's important, and that includes thinking about time. One of the key sort of signs, one of the key hallmarks of holiness, of being distinct for the people of Israel was, and still is, the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath. So they have a day that is set apart every week, and on that day the focus is to do no work, is to rest. It's a huge theme in the Old Testament. It's, as you read in the passage, as we read in the passage today, it's kind of the last command that God gives before Moses finishes and comes down, is the call to observe the Sabbath. And there's very strong language used about what happens if you don't observe the Sabbath. It's absolutely one of the key distinctions for people of Jewish faith, is observing the Sabbath. And over the centuries, a lot of thought and reflection and debate and discussion has gone on by Jewish teachers and scholars as to what it actually looks like to keep the Sabbath. How do you keep the Sabbath? What does it mean to do no work and to rest on the Sabbath? And actually, for those of us who are not practicing Jews, for those of us who are not Jews who observe the law, sometimes it can look a bit unusual as to what, breaks the Sabbath and what doesn't. So, for example, the disciples are walking through a field, which is fine, but when they start to take corn from the field, the Pharisees say you're breaking the Sabbath. What counts as breaking the Sabbath? Rabbi David Foreman tells a true story about a family who was celebrating before their daughter's wedding. Their daughter was getting married, so they decided they'd have a celebration. So they checked into a hotel as a family, and they were going to have a meal together to celebrate the fact that their daughter was getting married. And they checked into this hotel, and then they wake up and they've got to go to the room where the meal's being held, and it's on a different floor to where their hotel rooms were. And when they've woken up, that day is the Sabbath. So as observant Jews, is a day of rest for them. And one of the regulations for observant Jews is you cannot use electricity on the Sabbath, because by completing a circuit, flicking a switch, you complete a circuit, you create a spark, you make fire. So you can't use electricity on the Sabbath because you're making fire. You're not allowed to make fire on the Sabbath. So they had a problem because the father of the bride was actually not very well. He was in a wheelchair. And so they were figuring out, how are we going to get to this room when we can't use the lift? Because we can't use electricity. So what they decided to do was 5 of the sort of young men of the party, sons and sons-in-law, so the father of the bride sat in his wheelchair, and these 5 men physically lifted the wheelchair and carried him downstairs. And they were halfway down the stairs when another guest saw them and said, you don't need to do that, there's an elevator. And they said, thank you, but we can't. We're Jewish. Today's the Sabbath. Today is our day of rest. And this guest looked at them carrying a man in a wheelchair down the stairs. And he said, well, if today's your day of rest, I'd hate to see what a day of work looks like for you. And Rabbi Foreman makes the point. He says, it does look odd, doesn't it? That, using a lift is work, but carrying a man in a wheelchair downstairs isn't work. Why is that? Where does that come from? And, as you know, or as you can see from the passage, and many of you will know, the reason why the Sabbath is given, the sort of thinking behind the Sabbath, the authority behind the Sabbath, it takes its authority from the story of creation. On 6 days, God created the world, and on the seventh day, he rested. And that's where the Sabbath idea comes from, this story of creation in Genesis 1 and 2. That's the source of the Sabbath commands. That's the prototype for the Sabbath, the idea that after creating, God rested. But the question that the Jewish scholars asked, quite a natural question, is, well, why does God rest? Why does God rest? What does rest mean for God? Does God get tired? Lugging mountains around for 6 days, and he said, okay, I've had enough, I've finished, let's have a rest. Does God get tired? Is that why he rests? Well, Isaiah 40 tells us, he does not faint or grow weary. God does not get tired. God doesn't get worn out. God doesn't need sleep. So what does it mean that God rested? In what way does God rest and get refreshed? Well, the Jewish scholars and rabbis realize something. Most of us are creative in some way. You may not think of yourself as being a creative person, but you are. We all do creative things. Some of us, it's kind of obvious, like painting or writing or something like that. But we all do creative things. Maybe you enjoy cooking. That's creative. Maybe you enjoy DIY, putting up shelves, things like that. You are doing something creative when you do that. Maybe you get a real thrill sitting down in front of a computer and sort of putting together a spreadsheet. That's creative work. You are creating something. And any of us who know what it's like to create or to make something, we all know there comes a point where you have to sort of stop creating. It's tempting when you create to just never finish, to be fiddling around the edges. I don't know if you've ever done anything like that, where you're creating something and you think it's just not quite right. Maybe you taste the food, just needs a little bit more salt, just need to do something. You put up a shelf, is it straight? It's not quite, I just need to adjust it. When we create, there's this sense that we've just got to get it perfect. We've got to keep going, we've got to keep fiddling around the edges. But there is a point where you have to stop. You have to step back and say, you know what, it's finished, it's done. I'm not doing any more on it. Whether it's perfect or not, it is finished. And in Jewish thought, that is the type of rest that God does. So he's created, and him resting is him stepping back from what he's creating, saying it's finished, it's done. I am resting from creating. And that's the type of rest that we're talking about in the sort of the Sabbath regulations and so on. And this is how it's been understood in Jewish thought for centuries. The Sabbath is a day of resting in the same way that God rested, in that you stop creating, you stop making things, you stop taking raw materials and shaping them into something else. You don't make anything. That's why using a lift, pushing a button is work, because you're making fire. But carrying a man in a wheelchair down the stairs isn't work, because it's just physical exertion. It's not sort of creating, it's not making anything. One of them is sort of God work, creative work, and one of them is just physical labor. And this is why the Pharisees say to Jesus, they're telling him off for all kinds of things. If you read the Gospels, the Pharisees often criticize Jesus for breaking the Sabbath. Several times throughout the Gospels, one of the things they don't like Jesus doing is healing on the Sabbath. And you and I may say, well, what's wrong with healing someone on the Sabbath? And the point is, it's God work. It's creative work. It's doing the work of God. That's why you can't heal anyone on the Sabbath. And it looks there's an irony about it, isn't there? Saying, Jesus is healing people. And instead of saying, well, Jesus is healing people, this is incredible. They say, no, you're healing people wrong, Jesus. You're doing it wrong because you're doing it on the Sabbath. And Jesus' response to these criticisms throughout the Gospels is pretty similar every time. He comes back to them and sort of says, for example, one of the things he says is, what's the problem? You would untie animals and lead them to drink on the Sabbath. Another time he says, well, if a child or an animal fell into a well, you'd pull them out on the Sabbath, wouldn't you? Because healing on the Sabbath is breaking the Sabbath, but, leading an animal to water isn't. Pulling a child out of a well isn't breaking the Sabbath because it's just physical labor. But Jesus is making the point to the Pharisees that they're both sort of saving work. You're saving someone, you're healing someone, you're giving your animal a drink, you're pulling someone out of a well. It's saving work. It's all God work, basically. And it's always permissible. So Jesus is saying to the Pharisees, you need to think differently about the Sabbath. You need to think about what the Sabbath is and what it is for. And in the passage we read today from Mark, you see that Jesus says to the Pharisees, doesn't he, the Sabbath was given for us. We weren't created for the purpose of the Sabbath. The Sabbath did not exist first. The Sabbath was given to us as a gift. The Sabbath is supposed to be a gift. It's supposed to be a blessing. It's not supposed to be an obstacle to doing what God wants you to do. It's supposed to be for your benefit. It's not supposed to be something that confuses us or condemns us or we can use as a weapon against others. Now, over the years, the relationship between Christians and the Sabbath has been there's been a lot of words spoken and written about it. What does it mean for the Christians? We're not practicing Jews who are commanded to keep the Sabbath. What are we supposed to do about the Sabbath? What does it look like for us? There have been all kinds of debates over what we should do about the Sabbath. Even when is the Sabbath? When is the Sabbath? Because for Israel in the early church, Sabbath, of course, is a Saturday. That's the Sabbath in Jewish thought. But it's not even Saturday as we think about it, because in the Jewish calendar, the day starts at sunset. The day in the Jewish calendar goes from sunset to sunset. So Sabbath for the people of Israel was Friday evening to Saturday evening. That's their Sabbath. And that might make sense to people who do shift work, that the day starts in the evening. But for them, that was the Sabbath, Friday evening to Saturday evening. But for many Christians, many of us, if you say, well, when's the Sabbath? When's the day of rest? We would say, well, it's Sunday. It's Sunday, and that's because Emperor Constantine, the first Christian Roman emperor, decreed in 321 AD, he said, Sunday is a day of rest across the whole Roman Empire. So that's why, and of course Sunday makes sense for us because Sunday is the day we remember Christ rose from the dead. So why not have a day of rest on that magnificent day? The Christians have also debated about what is and isn't permissible on the Sabbath, on the day of rest, what you can and can't do on a Sunday or a Saturday, whatever it is. There have been lots of discussions, lots of words and books, but I just keep coming back to what Jesus says here. The Sabbath is supposed to be a blessing. Sabbath is supposed to be a gift. I've noticed something that we humans, we Christians, we are really, really good at taking God's gifts and turning them into problems. We're really good at that. And if you want a sermon on, when should the Sabbath be, what you could and couldn't do or should and shouldn't do on the Sabbath, then I'm absolutely sure you can look and you will find books, you will find podcasts, you'll find other sermons preached by people answering some of these questions. And some of them will be very good. Different perspectives than mine are available, and some of them will be much better than mine, I think. But I'm afraid you're stuck with me this morning. And my perspective is that the Sabbath is supposed to make us think differently about time. And actually, I feel like my job this morning, the thing that I think is most important about the Sabbath, and what I want to communicate to you this morning, is I think the way we view time is actually an example to see precisely how gracious God is. It's a chance to experience God's grace, and that's what I want to convey to you this morning. You see, the Sabbath is a call back to the story of creation. That's where it has its roots. When we celebrate or take a Sabbath or think about the Sabbath, we're supposed to tie it to the act of creation. 6 days God created, and on the seventh day he rested. 1 day a week set apart in memory of this thing that happened, in memory of creation. And what I want us to realize, what I want us to think about, is the idea that God says to us, not, I think you should have a day of rest a week because, you work hard and the week is long. God says to us, I made the world, and what I want you to do is rest. That's what God says. I made the world, and I want you to rest. God didn't need to rest, as we've heard. He did that, I think, so that he could point to it and say, you know what, this is what I want you to do. When you look at this story of creation, this is the part I want you to do. I want you to rest. And I think it's quite incredible that the response God wants from us of this amazing fact that he created everything we see, the response that God asks from us is, have a rest. Have a rest. That's what God says. The way we think about time and rest is dictated to us by the world we live in and the story that we're told. How you should and shouldn't spend your time is told to you by culture and society and the world we live in. The purpose of rest is told to us by the story of the world around us. You may not be aware of it. Maybe you've not thought about it, but that's absolutely what happens. When do we rest in a week? Typically, when do we rest? For most of us, not for Oz, unfortunately, it's Saturday or Sunday. We get to rest. And in our culture, in our society, what do we call that time? The weekend. The weekend. Even that word says something, doesn't it? Look forward to the weekend. Just got to get through the week to the weekend. That tells us that if you want rest, you do it at the end of the week. That's when you rest. You work first, then you rest. You rest after you've worked. You earn your rest. You deserve your rest. But there is a different story on offer. There is a different story that we are offered. The story of God offers us a different way of thinking about time. I mentioned earlier that the Jewish Sabbath is a Friday evening to a Saturday evening because the Jewish day starts at a sunset. Now let me ask you a question. For most of us, when does your day start? If you're like me, it starts when you wake up in the morning. Monday morning, that's the start of Monday. If your day starts at sunset, what's the first thing you do each day? Unless you're on night shifts or something like that. For most of us, if your day starts at sunset, the first thing you do each day is stop working, is rest. That's how your day begins, with rest. That's sort of the Jewish way of thinking about it. You are resting before you've even earned it. You are resting before you have got tired. You are resting before you deserve it. Where does this call to rest come from? The creation story. The idea that God rested is not some obscure piece of poetic language you find in the Psalms. It's right there. It's one of the first things you read if you open your Bible. God rested. The idea of having a day of rest is not some throwaway suggestion you find buried in one of Paul's letters at the back of the Bible. Paul saying, oh, you know what, it's a nice idea, you should have a rest every now and then. It's one of the 10 Commandments. It's a key law. It's repeated throughout the Old Testament. Warnings and promises attached to this concept of rest. Right at the beginning of God's story, he says, I'm going to introduce a concept to you, rest. It's one of the first things the Bible tells us about, rest. Think about all the things the Bible teaches us, all the things we think are important parts of our faith that are in the Bible. Does it strike you as odd that before the vast majority of them, one of the very first things God tells us about is rest? Rest. I don't think it's a coincidence or a random idea that the people of Israel start their days at sunset. I think it's because they are trying to be distinct. They're trying to be holy. They are perhaps unique among all the nations by saying that rest is not the goal, rest is our foundation. Rest is not where we are headed, rest is where we are supposed to start. So to be honest, I don't really know if it matters which day the Sabbath is, which day you have or not as a Sabbath. I don't really know if it matters what you do or don't do on that day. Because I think bubbling beneath underneath the call to the Sabbath is really, it's a call to remember who God is and who we are. I'm beginning to think that the point of the Sabbath is actually because God says to us, look at everything I've made. Look at it. Look at this world. Look at this whole universe. I did this. You didn't do this. You didn't do this. And what do I want you to do in response to this amazing news, the news that I made everything? Do I want you to work hard for me? Do I want you to show me what amazing things you can do in this world that I made? No, what I want you to do is put down your tools. I want you to stop fighting. I want you to stop running. I want you to rest. That's what I want you to do. I am giving you rest. You don't need to earn it. You don't need to deserve it. You don't need to work or not. I'm giving it to you. And that's the response I want from you. It overwhelms me to think that this idea of rest is so important to God that he puts it right there at the very beginning of the story. Before we read about what went wrong, before we read about how God makes it right, before we read about what a life lived for Christ looks like and demands, we read that God rested and says, this is the bit of the story I want you to do. This is what I want you to do in response. Would it make a difference to how you viewed life, to how you viewed yourself, how you viewed God, how you viewed time, if you thought that rest was actually the first thing God called you to do? Was actually the foundation of your relationship with him, not the last. Everything in this world is about getting stuff done, about being busy, about what we can achieve and what we can do. We don't stop anymore. We don't stop. We don't allow ourselves to just be. If there is silence, we have to fill it. If we have empty time in our schedule, we say, fantastic, empty time. What am I going to put in there? What can I cram in there? But what if God is actually saying to us, what I want you to do, first thing, is just stop. Just be. Just rest. That's actually a priority. What if that's the first thing God says to you? See, when we rest, whose work are we trusting? Not ours. We're trusting God's work. If we wake up one morning and do nothing all day, does it stop God loving us? Does it make a difference to how precious we are to him? No. It's what rest does. When we rest, we are choosing to be accepted by God regardless of anything else. We are saying, God, I just accept that you love me and you accept me. Nothing to do with me. Nothing to do with what I do and what I can achieve and what I can show you. I'm just being. And you love me and accept me. That's what rest does. That's what rest does. Rest is when you realize that it's God's work that matters, not yours. Rest is when you realize that it's God who provides, not you. When you rest, you are accepted. regardless of anything else. Over the years, I've come to think differently about time and God and what he actually wants from us and what he values. I don't think it's a bad idea at all to set a day apart to rest. I don't think it's a bad idea to set time apart to just remember that it's God who does it, not us. That we are accepted by him regardless of who we are and what we do. But I've also begun to wonder if Sabbath, this concept's not really a day in a week, but it's actually a way of living. It's a way of living. Because what stops us from waking up in the morning and deciding, you know what, today is a day of resting in God. Today is a day of resting in God. It's not necessarily a day about doing nothing, as we see from Jesus' example. He did all kinds of things on the Sabbath. He was very busy. It's not necessarily a day of doing nothing, but it is a day of resting in God. It's a day in which we say, you know what, today is not, I'm not looking at today like it's some mountain that I've got to climb. Today I'm looking at a day of just being accepted by God, regardless of what happens, regardless of what I get done or don't get done. Today I'm trusting God's story, not the world's story. Today I'm choosing to say, you know, God, you're enough for me today. I don't need anything else today. I just need you. That's it. Maybe every day can be set apart. Maybe every day can be holy time if we approach it that way. Maybe it's still the Sabbath if you have a full day of work. I don't know. But I'm becoming more and more convinced that learning to rest, learning to just be accepted by God, learning to trust God's story rather than ours is not an optional extra. It's not something we make time for if we can afford it, if we can fit it in. It is a gift. It's a gift. And it is supposed to be our home.